Hello, good morning, and Happy New Year, all. I hope that you had a safe and restorative and spirited holiday break. Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us for today's session, Vicarious Trauma. My name is Courtney Cintron. I'm Ingenuity's partner engagement specialist, and I'm also joined here today by Nicole Upton, Ingenuity's Director of Partnerships and Professional Learning, and today's facilitator, there Nicole just waved, and today's facilitator, Kandice Manciel, Trauma Specialist of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth. So welcome, Kandice, as well. Today's session, Vicarious Trauma, is really about acknowledging, addressing, and understanding that the trauma that students are experiencing in their lives can also take an emotional and physical toll on educators and those in caring professions as well, especially during these times. So today we'll focus a little bit on how to identify the signs and symptoms of those of caring trauma and ways to prevent and address those traumas and cultivate and promote self-care and collective care. But Kandice will get a little bit more into that as we move along here. So just a few important notes before we begin. If you haven't already, we ask that you please take a moment to update your name with your preferred pronouns and your organization's name. You can do that by hovering over your image icon and selecting the three dots. It'll give you the option to update. Also, please make sure to sign in using the sign-in sheet that's available in the chat. This allows us to track attendance. And if you're a CPS teacher looking for credit hours, you can log in your name and the time in and out as well. Please note that today's session and all of the sessions that are a part of this training will be recorded. So only our session facilitators will be recorded. Any participants who are using their video or audio component will be excluded from the final recording of this program. So I'm also going to make the slides available in PDF format into the chat here for everyone as well, so you can follow along. I would also like to provide you with a content notice for this training program. So the content and discussion in today's session and throughout this program is going to engage with trauma, and that can be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. So do what you need to do. If you need to step out, we understand. Our session facilitators will flag the specific content and terminology that will be used in today's session. And we'll do our best to make this a virtual classroom, a space where you can engage bravely and empathetically and thoughtfully with the challenging content. We'd also like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement to recognize and honor Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land, and as a step toward correcting the practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. So we'd like to acknowledge that this virtual classroom is taking place on the stolen land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox, also call this area home. Because of the Great Lakes and the waterways, the land naturally became a site of travel, of healing, of trade, and gathering for more than a dozen other Native tribes. And it's still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois that are still practicing their traditions and caring for the land. So as we begin the program, let's just take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we're standing on and support the resilience and the strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide, and begin to rethink our own relationship with the land and its original peoples. Thank you. Okay, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time or who may not have heard about the full scope of this program, I'm going to briefly walk through a little bit about the program, its goals, how it came together. And for those of you that are returning or who have been with us a couple of times, thank you so much for your patience. I know that it's a little bit repetitive with that. And we'll drop a link into the chat to the program's webpage that you can browse, follow along, and register for any other upcoming sessions as well. Let me go ahead and do that for you. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, so the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Training Program for Arts Partners is bringing together a diverse team of trauma-informed organizations and practitioners, including Chicago Growth Mindset, Illinois Collaboration on Youth, and Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative, and the Institute of Therapy through the Arts, all with the aim of providing arts partners with sector-wide assistance in capacity building and understanding, and implementing and advancing trauma-informed and healing-centered principles into practice. So these sessions have also been designed to help create the space for the sector to really consider how the role of arts and arts education can also help mitigate the impacts of trauma and help students thrive during this time and also beyond. So the program has been conceived in two primary parts. So part one of the program is centered around building a trauma-informed care and healing-centered knowledge base. And that's through a series of 13 trainings, one of course, which you're in right now, facilitated by the consortium of organizations that I previously discussed. So many of the topics are speaking to the current moment and are providing an essential foundation to trauma-informed care. When working with our collaborators on this program, we also really wanted to ensure that the needs of both organizations and individual educators and teaching artists would be met. So we did divide the subsequent sessions into two different learning tracks. One to meet the specific needs of organizations and also ensure an understanding that this work requires the effort of people at every single level, not just educators on the ground, but also to meet the learning needs of teaching artists and educators as well, such as today's topic, Vicarious Trauma. However, all of the sessions, while specific, are also covering universal topics that will definitely be beneficial for anyone in the sector and even beyond the sector. So we definitely have seen people joining us from honestly all over the world. So that's been multiple industries. So that's been really amazing. Part two of the program will begin in March and will include a series of collective impact sessions across artistic discipline. Those sessions will be facilitated by members of the Institute for Therapy through the Arts. And those sessions will be directed at gaining a better understanding of how this work really shows up in the arts and what some folks are already doing that is trauma-informed in the arts. Then the program will culminate in a final toolkit and a guidebook. It's going to include a comprehensive assessment mapped to all of the trainings and a number of resources from each session, as well as those recorded video trainings. So look out for that later on in the summer. So this is all obviously really amazing, but we didn't get here by ourselves. The genesis of this project really started with the Arts Ed Response Collective. At the start of the pandemic, Ingenuity convened stakeholders across the arts ed sector, including CPS teachers, administrators, arts partners, students, and funders, all to gain a better understanding of what their challenges were during this time of the pandemic and to proactively and collectively determine ways to mitigate those challenges and plan for the future. And what emerged from that process was a really clear need to understand the ways that art could be used as a tool for recovery and healing from crisis. There was also a need to have an authentic learning experience, authentic learning practices that would truly support professionals in expanding their practices. So as an immediate response, Ingenuity initially started off with a shorter 3-part training series in partnership with the Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative. Those trainings provided partners with an important foundation to trauma-informed principles and practices. But then we received a lot of great feedback from partners, and we wanted to build off of that work and really create something that was ongoing and even more dynamic and robust. And we wanted also a really diverse group of facilitators with various approaches, unique experiences and perspectives to meet the needs of our diverse partner communities. And the program then really evolved from there, and here we are. So thank you so much for making this possible. So before we get started, I'm just going to briefly outline some norms for these sessions. We've divided the session norms into a few different categories here, as you can see. Under equity of voice and learning, we have take space, make space. So as a participant, we just ask that you please be mindful of any privileged identities that you may hold and help to create an environment for everyone to contribute. Speak from personal experience. So let's own our statements and views about things, and let's not presume to be able to speak for others. For being in the moment, we have acknowledged the struggle of the times that we're in. Yes, things are unpredictable right now, and they're challenging right now. Things may not always go 100% as planned, so we may have to be extra patient and flexible. And under how we show up for ourselves and each other, we have an openness to learning. So an understanding that we're all learners in this space. I have also used the chat box mindfully. When using the chat box, we just ask that you try to make your questions or comments as relevant to what we're talking about on the screen as possible. And then confidentiality. So we ask that you take away lessons, but not personal content. So we will sometimes knowledge share, do breakout sessions, co-sharing ideas and resources. But if anyone does share something personal, we ask that you don't bring it out of the space. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Kandice Manciel, trauma specialist of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth, to bring us through today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And good morning to everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and happy New Year to everyone. I hope that this year brings us hope and helps us in taking better care of ourselves. Hopefully you'll be able to get some of those tools and techniques through today's training and some awareness of some of the caring traumas that you may be experiencing yourself. So once again, my name is Kandice Manciel, and I serve as a trauma specialist for the Illinois Collaboration on Youth, or ICOY. I have my contact information here just in case any of you would like to follow up with me if you have any questions or ideas or thoughts that come up following today's training. I love to interact with all of you that are doing all this amazing work. So feel free to reach out and I will get back to you within typically 24 to 48 hours. I have my fun fact here that when I'm not working as a trauma specialist for ICOY, I provide individual trauma therapy. And I always like to share this little fun fact because I think it does a really good job of helping folks to see how I've been on the different sides of this spectrum. So I've been in the room with families, with youth, with individual adults from all different types of walks of life that have experienced trauma and how it shows up in the room. I've also been that caregiver, that therapist that is providing this intense trauma work and experiencing the caring traumas myself, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, just being a couple of them. And then I have the privilege of being in this role as a trainer, so I can say firsthand that I have seen the direct impact and experienced the direct impact of vicarious trauma. So, as we prepare to go into today's training, it's really important that we go over what our objectives are. What is it that we are hoping that you all take away from today's training? So we've got 4 objectives here. The first is to provide an overview of trauma and its impact. You know, trauma is a really popular word, especially lately. And what we'll do is we'll really explore what it is. We won't spend too much time going over it, but we will do a little bit digging to make sure that we're all on the same page here. We'll also take a look at the system of who trauma impacts. Secondly, we'll look at discussing the differences between various types of trauma and different types of terms related to trauma to promote a better understanding and identification in order to be able to better address vicarious trauma when it shows up. So we'll take a look at the differences between different types of ways or different signs and symptoms and indications of trauma in order to better equip providers to respond to traumatized clients, to respond to coworkers, employees, and themselves. Thirdly, we'll look at contextualizing concepts by examining systemic issues that can contribute to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So we'll take a look at the cycle that's often common in developing vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, because as we'll see as we go throughout this training, these caring traumas are typically not things that just pop up overnight, right? It's a slow moving process, and it's important that we do as best as we can and try to catch it early if we have the privilege to do so. And then lastly, we'll learn about ways to address vicarious trauma, including self-care and collective care strategies. So how do we treat vicarious trauma from a personal and a more systemic approach? We'll also look at developing an understanding of what the term collective care means. But before we do that, we'll start out with a self-care check. As Courtney mentioned in the introduction portion of today's training, you know, we are talking about trauma, so it goes without saying that this can become triggering for some of us, and that is okay. So as Courtney said earlier, please do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself during today's training. I have here a few suggestions, but if you have some other things in mind too, please go for it. First and foremost, we have here, step out and take a break. Go get a breath of fresh air and come on back. Engage your senses. Maybe, you know, you have your favorite piece of chocolate that you sit next to you and you eat when things feel a little bit rough or feel a little bit triggering. Stand up and stretch, because we know that trauma has a way of storing up in our bodies. It's really important that we're getting up, we're moving around and working that out. And then lastly, I would like you to think about, who is it that you can debrief with after this training has ended? Who is it that you can talk to if you find that you have felt triggered, or even if you felt inspired and have new ideas? Who is it that you can talk to afterwards? So I'm encouraging you to take 10 seconds right now to write down the name of at least one person that you can debrief with. Because in the spirit of self-care, which is intentional, it's planned, it anticipates triggers, this is something that we want to do before we're in that moment where we're having a hard time. So let's go ahead and take 10 seconds and then we'll continue. You'll write down the name of at least one person you can talk to. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. If it wasn't, feel free to continue to write as we move along. So as we get into the topic of vicarious trauma, I think it's really important that we do a check-in with our bodies. So I'm inviting you to join me in a grounding exercise. Don't feel pressured to, but if you feel comfortable, feel free to join me. And you can do this sitting or standing. What we're going to do is we're going to be focusing on how our body feels from head to toe, taking a moment to notice each part. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Feel free to join me if you'd like. So as you sit or stand wherever you are, can you feel your hair on your shoulders or on your forehead? If you have on glasses, do you notice the weight of the glasses on your ears or on your nose? The weight of your shirt or your sweater on your shoulders? The texture of it against your skin? Do your arms currently feel loose or stiff at your sides? Can you feel your heartbeat right now? If you can, is it rapid or is it very steady right now? Does your stomach feel full right now? Or if you like me and haven't had breakfast yet, are you feeling a little bit hungry? Are your legs currently crossed? Or are your feet resting on the floor? Is your back slumped? Is it straight? Let's take a moment and check in with our hands and our feet. I invite you to curl your fingers, make a fist, and loosen it. Maybe curl your toes tight, loosen them, and wiggle. Are you barefoot or in shoes right now? How does your feet feel against the floor? I encourage you to take your feet and press them down into the ground momentarily, and then release, allowing yourself to feel supported by the earth, by the floor, as we prepare to move forward into the material and be present. Thank you for joining me in that activity. So let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about trauma and its impact. What I'm going to ask you all to do, because we're going to be engaging in several different forms of participation activities today, including the chat box, breakout rooms, as well as polls. So we're going to start out by breaking out that chat box. And I'm going to ask you to share what comes to mind when you think of the word trauma. So what comes to your mind first when you think of the word trauma? So you're going to go ahead and share via the chat box, please. Pain, systemic isms, yes. Pain, ACEs, we'll talk about the ACEs a little bit later. Stress, tears and sadness, hurt, interruption to the core, absolutely. Do we have anyone else? Resentment. Intergenerational, spot on. Constant static, personal experiences. Mhm. Lasting, so ongoing, or lasting impacts, I would imagine. Something that impacts your current well-being. Trauma is a catch-22. Stuck and frozen, debilitating. These are great. These are great. Feel free to keep them going if you'd like. Unpredictable responses, absolutely. And we will talk more about that in just a bit. I'm going to keep going here. Thank you so much for your responses. So there are tons of different types of traumatic events, right? So some traumas like physical abuse and school violence are those more blatant and direct forms of trauma that we can easily identify, right? But not all traumatic events have as much of an obvious impact for those of us who may be looking from the outside looking in. For example, a person who has an incarcerated relative, for example, some things to keep in mind is that this relative may have been the main breadwinner. And as a result, housing may now become unstable. A lack of food and other essential items may now be a new reality. And then we also have to think about that loss of that attachment figure as well, creating a substantial impact. Now, another way we could also look at this is for those of you who are working in the caring fields like yourselves. You're doing the hard work every day, right? And you notice the different ways that trauma is showing up amongst your students, amongst the different participants in your programs, all these different youth. But how often do you take a moment to stop and check in with yourself and notice the fact that you engaging with students, especially students who have experienced different types of trauma, you are experiencing trauma as well. Secondary traumatic experiences, which we'll get into a little bit later. So the whole point of this slide here is to recognize and acknowledge the fact that traumatic events are not always very blatant and direct. Sometimes they're more nuanced. As I mentioned before, the process of compassion fatigue, of vicarious trauma, of burnout, and so on and so forth, as we'll get into later, is a slow moving process. So it's really important that we are aware of this process, that we are tuned in, and that we are able to provide self-care for ourselves and develop healthy coping skills in order to be able to combat the effects of these traumatic events. So what exactly is trauma? We like to use Samsa's 3E definition of trauma to explain it. So it reads that trauma is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So let's break this definition down just a little bit more. So first we have the event. And an event can have unique effects on that individual's well-being, and it may vary from person to person, and it may vary in severity as well. A particular event may be experienced as traumatic for one individual, but not necessarily for another. How the individual labels, assigns meaning to, and is disrupted physically and psychologically by an event will contribute to whether or not it is experienced as traumatic. So then we have the effects part. So the effects may take place immediately or be delayed in onset. And in some situations, individuals may not recognize the connection between the events and the effects. Some examples of adverse effects may include an individual's inability to cope with the normal stresses and strains of daily living, or an individual having a very hard time being able to trust others in relationships, being able to trust providers such as yourselves or teachers such as yourselves. They may have a hard time if they've experienced attachment relationships that were unstable, unpredictable, unsupportive, or damaging. So what does a traumatic event look like in the workplace? It can look like so many different things. So first and foremost, one of the big reasons this slide is so important is because it helps us to remember that trauma is a systemic process. It's a systemic thing. Trauma doesn't just take place out there in the world. It also happens in the workplace, okay? It's almost impossible to leave life at the door when we're entering the workplace or the workspace for those of us that are currently working remotely. And if we're being really honest, sometimes the workplace itself is a perpetuator of trauma. So it's really important that we keep in mind that while we cannot always prevent traumatic events from happening, we can at least become more informed in order to be able to look for symptoms and signs and develop and implement trauma-informed policies in order to support staff. So here we have 4 different columns of how we break down what traumatic events can look like in the workplace, bearing in mind that this, of course, is not a completely exhaustive list. There are so many different things above and beyond this list that could be considered a traumatic event. First, we have stressful events. So some things to think about here is as it relates to accidents in the workplace or working with youth who maybe have experienced suicide or have experienced or currently experiencing grief, especially when you think about COVID-19. What policies are in place in your organization to be able to accommodate employees who are experiencing these stressful events? Is there FMLA available? Is there EAP available? Are mental health days a thing? These are things that we want to think about and have conversations about. Then we look at the organizational stressors. We have bullying here. We have threats, harassment, extreme isolation. And it's funny because this training we originally created before COVID-19 happened. And that extreme isolation was something that we really talked about for folks who are working remotely, and how if you don't make a conscious effort to make sure that staff are still feeling connected to their work, to their teammates, to their supervisors, you run the risk of folks feeling extremely isolated, and that is triggering and that is traumatic. So now we have tons and tons of people who are working remotely right now, right? And not only that, it was a process that happened very quickly for the sake of trying to reduce harm or reduce the spread of COVID-19. So we've had a lot of folks who have shared, that it has been really difficult for them working remotely because they do not have that connection if you are not being intentional as an organization to make sure that that is there. Then we have chronic pressure as well, toxic work environment, uncertainty is really big right now, as well as that downsizing or fear of unemployment in the face of this pandemic that we're in, not really knowing what's going to happen. And then we have physical stressors, and that can encompass so many things. For those of us who may be working in an office setting right now, going into homes, working in the community, or working remotely, there's always some different type of physical stressor that is taking place. So we want to make sure that we keep in mind the fact that just because someone might be working at home doesn't mean it's always the most ideal situation. And that situation could be contributing to feeling triggered or feeling vicarious trauma or feeling compassion fatigue or burnout and so on and so forth. So someone mentioned the ACEs study when I asked you all, what are some things that come to mind when you think about trauma? And I'm so glad that you mentioned the ACEs study because this is a big thing, right? So the ACEs study, for those of you who may not be as familiar, took place back in the 1990s. Over 2,000 folks participated in this study, where ultimately they were able to take note of a correlation of individuals who reported having experienced at least 2 adverse childhood experiences, which you see there on those leaves and branches, had a higher likelihood of reporting having experienced negative outcomes as it relates to physical health, behavioral health, social health, mental health, and so on and so forth. So having these negative outcomes if you reported having experienced at least 2 adverse childhood experiences in your lifetime. So this is big, right? It's really, really important that we keep this in mind. But what's even more important that we keep in mind is what happened to contribute to those adverse childhood experiences. So this tree, which we call the pair of ACEs tree, does a really great job of illustrating that. We see here that the adverse childhood experiences are the leaves on the tree, but a tree doesn't start there, right? The tree starts in the soil and in the roots, and then we have the leaves. So the soil represents adverse collective historical experiences. I remember someone in the chat also mentioning intergenerational trauma. Completely spot on. So when you think about slavery, genocide, mass incarceration, Holocaust, forced displacement, and many other additional collective historical experiences that wouldn't even fit on this image. Think about the different ways in which that has affected generations and how that has transmitted across generations. And then we have adverse community environments. So when we think about the populations who are represented in the soil here, right? Then we think about what happened. What happened next? We have this community violence in particular neighborhoods, lack of access to affordable and safe housing, and safe water and safe clean air, lack of educational and economic opportunities, the presence of racism and discrimination, and the experiencing of poverty in certain populations. It's no wonder we have all of these adverse childhood experiences that are a result of all of these things. So I gave you a little teeny bit of a cheat, but what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how does trauma impact us. So many different ways that it does, but I'm going to have us launch a poll right now to share how trauma impacts us. So we're going to be answering 3 different questions here about how it impacts the body, how it impacts us emotionally, and how it impacts one's behavior. So feel free to take your time to go ahead and answer the questions here on this poll, and then we'll share the results afterwards. So we'll take a couple minutes to go ahead and answer the questions on the poll. Okay, we got about a minute left. And I see we have just over half of you all that have responded. Thank you so much for your participation. All right, awesome. So here we have the results of the poll. So the first question asks, please select below ways in which trauma can impact the body. We have most of you all selected heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, sleep-wake cycle, and hair growth. Well, most of you selected the first 3. Not as many selected hair growth, but hair growth would definitely be up there too. Think about, some of you may have experienced this, or at least know some folks who have. When you experience a lot of stress, sometimes you might notice that you have hair that's falling out, or hair that's breaking off, or hair that's just not growing anymore. And then we have the second question here. Please select the ways in which trauma can impact us emotionally. So most of you selected the experience of shame, that it may be difficult to communicate emotions verbally, interference with age-appropriate self-regulation, and not as many of you selected intense feelings of happiness. Yeah, that was the one that was supposed to throw you off. So good job. And the last one here asks, how might the experience of trauma impact one's behavior? Most of you selected aggression. Absolutely. Some of you selected hypervigilance, high activity levels, and elimination challenges. All of these are correct. So thank you so much for participating. And now I'm going to go through each of these different areas and spend a little bit more time breaking them down. So first we'll start with trauma in the body. And I love this quote that reads, the body continues to defend against a threat that belongs in the past. As I mentioned during the self-care slide at the very beginning of this training, the body holds on to trauma. So any trauma that we experience emotionally or psychologically, we also experience physically. So think about if you've ever seen a picture of a president when they enter the office, and then after 4 or 8 years, the difference in how they look. Think about all of the gray hair or all of the balding that has taken place or all the weight that's been gained, or the wrinkles or whatever it may be, whatever signs and symptoms of aging, um, but have happened in a very rapid process. The level of toxic stress that those presidents experience shows on their body. So just imagine the different ways that it impacts us inwardly as well, or internally as well. So when your body perceives a threat, what it does is it activates the stress response. And this is really necessary when we think about fight or flight. We think about back in the day when we had to defend against all types of different animals and things like that in order to survive. And it's also necessary when we're in actually physically threatening situations. But because for most of us, that's not the case on a day-to-day basis, remaining in that very vigilant state, that activated state on a long-term basis is damaging to our bodily processes and damaging to our overall health, our long-term health. We can't stay in that constant hypervigilant state because that wear and tear is completely harmful to us. Not only does it lead to interpersonal challenges, but can also turn into health issues. So you'll see some examples here that may include hyperarousal, higher heart rate, higher blood pressure, issues with muscles and digestion, difficulty regulating blood sugar, an immune system that may be impaired, difficulty with your sleep-wake cycle. So you may find that you're sleeping a lot, or you're not getting enough sleep, or you're able to fall asleep, but staying asleep throughout the night is a challenge. You may also find yourself experiencing headaches and other somatic symptoms. And dissociation is huge when we think about folks who have experienced trauma as well. They find themselves dissociating even after the trauma has taken place. Think about those students or those program participants that are in the room with you, but they're not in the room. It seems like they're always daydreaming, their mind is somewhere else. It's likely dissociation. Then we have trauma and emotion. So it is the case that people can have many different emotional reactions to trauma, both during the experience as well as afterwards. Some common emotional responses are anger, fear, sadness, and shame. And oftentimes individuals can have difficulty regulating their emotional responses as they may have strong feelings associated with the past trauma that they believe will lead them to feeling out of control, or that the expression of those feelings is too dangerous. So many times what happens is trauma evokes either one of two emotional extremes, either feeling overwhelmed or feeling completely numb, because emotions in general are just not safe. So here we have trauma and behavior. So when we think about the kiddos who are in the room with us, or the teenagers, adolescents that are in the room with us and are struggling with regulating their behavior, it's really important that we're able to reframe the manifestation of their behaviors as likely being an attempt to manage the emotional intensity and distressing aspects of whatever traumatic experience they've gone through. It's also important to keep in mind that many people cope in different ways. And further, coping strategies can be healthy or unhealthy. For example, some healthy ways of coping might include writing in a journal, reading books, exercising, talking and socializing with friends and loved ones. Some unhealthy ways of coping might include self-destructive behaviors, violence, or even extreme withdrawal. And also, remembering that coping strategies are not meant to distract from the intensity of the experience, but rather to help individuals to self-regulate in the moment so that they can then return to process through the emotional experience. Then we have trauma and relationships. So attachment is defined as an enduring or long-lasting emotional tie to a specific person. Attachment behaviors are activated during stressful events, and it guides the child to seek safety with the caregiver when they feel uncertainty or fear. This is the natural order of things. Caregivers act as a safe haven and a secure base. And when a child is distressed, if the parent is a safe haven or the caregiver, the child knows that they can return to that caregiver for comfort and safety. When the caregiver is a secure base, the child knows that the caregiver is a dependable person from which they can venture out into the world and explore. And if things go wrong, that they can safely come back. However, if the distress that a child is experiencing is so overwhelming, or the caregivers themselves are the source of the distress, then the child is unable to modulate their arousal. The child learns that they cannot rely on their caregiver or other potential attachment figures such as yourselves. Long-term issues with attachment can manifest as problems with boundaries, uncertainty about the reliability and predictability of the world, distrust and suspiciousness, social isolation, difficulty with perspective taking, difficulty attuning to other people's emotional states and points of view, and difficulty enlisting other people as allies. These are just some examples of how this might show up. And then we have trauma and self-concept or world beliefs. So it also goes without saying that trauma can impact the way that we view ourselves and the world that we live in. For many individuals, it's possible to internalize shame or guilt regarding their experience, especially when considering the way that others often react when hearing about their traumatic experiences. I believe someone mentioned shame when I asked you all what comes to mind when you think about trauma. This internalization can present in many different ways, such as feeling unworthy of love, feeling like you're a bad person, or even feeling powerless over your own life. And in addition to the way that trauma changes the way people think about themselves, it can influence the way we see others and the way that we see the world and our relationship with the world. For example, one might believe now that people are untrustworthy and the world is an unfair and an unsafe place. And for many folks, that has been their experience. So now that we have gotten a better understanding about trauma, what it is, how it shows up, what it looks like in the individuals that we serve, now we're going to get into the caring traumas. We're going to get into vicarious trauma. We're going to get into compassion fatigue, burnout, and on and on and on. So now we have that base level understanding, and let's start to dive into the bulk of today's material. So we'll start out with empathy. As providers in whatever capacity that you all are serving in around the world, empathy is one of our biggest strengths. It helps us and allows us to be able to connect with the individuals that we work with on a deeper level. It allows us to meet them where they're at. It allows us just to connect with them. But it will be irresponsible to not acknowledge the fact that empathy also makes us susceptible to caring trauma such as vicarious trauma. So we're going to watch a video about empathy here, getting a better understanding of what exactly empathy is compared to sympathy, because a lot of times, unfortunately, they get mixed up. So we'll start with that.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I see we have some Brene. She is awesome. I love that video. I think it does a really good job, like I said, helping us to really understand what empathy is, what the difference is between empathy and sympathy. And when we've been in the field so long, at times, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it can get easy to slide into sympathetic responses, sympathy in general, and having a harder time maintaining that empathy because we're feeling burned out. And that's true. So some key takeaways from the video is that empathy is feeling with people. That is also a choice of making oneself vulnerable to connect with another person because you know that feeling. And when I think about the caring traumas, when I think about the caring fields, there's this quote that I want to share with you that I think is just so spot on. We have not been directly exposed to the trauma scene itself, but we hear the story told with such intensity, or we hear similar stories so often, or we have the gift and curse of extreme empathy and we suffer. We feel the feelings of our clients. We experience their fears. We dream their dreams. Eventually, we lose a certain spark of optimism, humor, and hope. We tire. We are not sick, but we are not ourselves. So let's get a little bit more into empathy. So Brene in the video mentioned Teresa Wiseman. So she defined 4 attributes of empathy as the following: being able to see the world as others see it. So taking on the task of seeing things from someone else's perspective than just your own. Also being non-judgmental, which becomes really hard to do, especially for those of us who've been in the field for a long time and have kind of developed that callus, right? And you've seen certain things over and over again. So now you've become this expert, or you know the answers or all those other things, which obviously I'm being sarcastic here. That's not how it should be, but oftentimes that's what we find ourselves tied into. And we'll touch on that a bit more when we get into the cycle of how that works. The third defining attribute of empathy is understanding another person's feelings. And lastly, communicating your understanding of that person's feelings, that reflection, that making sure that you're on the same page with them, making sure that you're really getting what it is that they're bringing, making sure that you're on the same page with them, understanding what it is that they might need from you as far as support goes or resources. And I'm going to ask everyone to make sure you go ahead and mute yourself. Some background noises here. So as we listen empathetically to the stories of our clients, it becomes impossible not to enter their world and experience their pain. The same way that trauma impacts our clients is the same way that it impacts us. Okay. So I'll say that again, just in case you didn't catch it before I was muted. The same way that trauma impacts our clients is the same way that it impacts us, especially when we are empathically connecting with them. The reality is that as long as we as humans are able to empathically connect with others, we will always experience some level of suffering, some level of emotional challenge or fatigue. This is even more accurate for those of us who work in roles in which we provide care to others. So the task becomes, how do we anticipate the caring traumas, acknowledge them, and support one another? So here what we have is a breakdown of the different processes of how these secondary traumas, primary trauma, organizational stress happens, and the different potential outcomes of them. So first we have primary trauma, right? We have secondary trauma, which is those of us who may not have necessarily been in the same place at the time of the event of the trauma, right? But we hear the story with such vividness. We recall it. We're having flashbacks about what we've heard and visualizing what we've heard, and it impacts our day-to-day functioning. And then we have the organizational stress. What's happening in the workplace? How are folks being supported? Is there reflective supervision happening? Is there supportive supervision happening? Are there resources in place to be able to help accommodate and help take care of employees? So that's that exposure piece. If it's not there, then what happens next is the process. You may notice some physical, behavioral, and affective responses. And if you think back to the earlier part of the training where we broke down the different ways trauma can show up in our bodies, emotionally, socially, worldview, that is what that box encompasses, as well as that changes in worldview and sense of meaning to the right of there. The outcomes are not always negative. Sometimes the outcome can be positive as well. So on the negative end, we have vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, PTSD, burnout, compassion fatigue. But the possibilities are also positive. So that could look like vicarious resilience, post-traumatic growth, or even compassion satisfaction. And I'll give you an example of that compassion satisfaction a little bit later when I share a resource with you all. So here we have several different types of caring traumas. We have burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma. So something to keep in mind is that when it comes to burnout, burnout is about the work. Burnout is not something that is field specific. Burnout can happen in any type of work that we do. So burnout is essentially a state of psychological and physical exhaustion, which comes from that prolonged exposure to stressful work environment. So let's say you have high workload, or you are working a lot of hours. You have not taken a chance to have some time off. Maybe you don't have the luxury of taking time off, or maybe you do, but maybe you feel pressured by your workplace to not take time off, right? So that results in the progressive loss of idealism, energy, and goals as a result of personal or occupational stress. So that's different from compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue adds the emotional aspect. So with compassion fatigue, we see a decline, a gradual decline in the ability of caregivers to empathically engage or connect with others. So this wall begins to be built up. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. Then there's that gradual desensitization to client stories and problems. It's just hard for you to even be present when you're in the room. Your mind is somewhere else. You don't feel empathy, or you don't feel as much empathy as you have in the past. And then that diminished capacity to experience joy, because something that we must keep in mind here is when we build up this callus, when we build up this wall to protect us from feeling these emotions that may be more difficult to deal with or to sit with, that wall also is going to block out those positive emotions as well. It's a catch-all. Then we have secondary traumatic stress. So here, you're traumatized not by that direct experience, but as I mentioned in the previous slide, but by hearing about the traumatic events experienced by others. And the effects, however, are very similar to if you were there when whatever the trauma is took place. So you may notice that you're experiencing intrusive imagery, hyperarousal, avoiding reminders, distressing emotions, and functional impairment. Having worked in the field of trauma therapy for so long, and for most of my time in the field, I have worked with with kids, with young children, with older kids, with teens, with adolescents, with parents who have had their children taken away. So you can imagine how often all of these different caring traumas showed up, but especially secondary traumatic stress. Having colleagues of mine who were experiencing, having nightmares about some of the things that they heard about, or having being triggered, when they're out and about and not even in the work field, are just some examples of how this might show up. Then we have vicarious trauma, which is the topic of today's training. And that's the cumulative result of empathic engagement with traumatized clients and exposure to their stories and their symptoms. So not just hearing their stories, but seeing the way it shows up in the room. Effects are similar to if you had experienced a primary or secondary trauma, but it also includes a disruption to the caregiver's sense of spirituality and meaning of hope. So feeling hopeless, feeling like, well, what's the point in doing this anyway? I'm going to go to work, but is it really going to make a difference? Or am I just doing this just to get a paycheck at this point? Because really, what I can do for others is not really going to make that much of a difference anyway. So this gives us a little bit more of an idea of the different ways that burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious traumatization show up. So here we have, when you think about burnout, you might notice that you're experiencing fatigue, anger, which actually can go across all three of these. You might be experiencing some frustration, lots of cynicism. And I can remember lots of times in my experiences as a trauma therapist, when we would have those weekly department meetings, a bunch of trauma therapists all in a room, and just the cynicism that was just going, and the sarcasm that was going across the room just the whole time, as our way of being able to cope with the difficult things that we were sitting with. Was it healthy? No. But it's how it shows up. Then we have that withdrawal piece too. Finding yourself not wanting to engage with others. Finding yourself not really enjoying the things that you are used to enjoying. We think of compassion fatigue, and we'll notice that some of the signs are similar to burnout. So you might experience some sadness, some grief, some avoidance or dread of working with some patients or clients or students. I can tell you for myself, I definitely experienced this. And it was interesting because when you do the work, when you do this work, when you're in these types of fields, when you meet new people in different types of settings, and they ask, oh, what do you do for a living? And you tell them, and they, oh my gosh, thank God for you. I could never do that. Your work is so important. How are you able to go home and not think about the things that your clients tell you? I would just be an emotional wreck all the time. And I would remember thinking to myself when I would hear things like that, I must be doing pretty good because I don't have that issue at all. I'm fine. I'm able to compartmentalize, and I do not take work home with me. But what I didn't realize was the different ways that the caring trauma show up. It is not just going home and crying yourself to sleep every night. It also includes that compassion fatigue, that dread of working with particular clients, that being in the room with them, but your mind is somewhere else, that secretly hoping that they might cancel or do a no-show that day. Things that don't feel good to say out loud, but it's important that I do say it out loud so that you know that you are not alone. And when you're noticing that that's happening, that is a really, really good indication that it's time to do some internal work, that it's time to engage in some really great reflective supervision. It might be time to take a little time off. So then we have vicarious traumatization. And you'll also notice that you're going to see some overlap here as well. So sadness as well may be commonplace with vicarious traumatization, as well as anxiety. Some apathy, so just kind of being checked out, really don't care what happens this way or another. Intrusive imagery, so that those thoughts and images that just pop into your head. Somatic complaints, so feeling of illness, pain, and those relational disturbances. So having difficulties in your relationships as a result of the work that you're doing. So we talked about the caring traumas. We talked about the different ways that this might show up. So now that we have spent a little bit of time focusing on vicarious trauma, focusing on burnout, focusing on getting a better understanding of what secondary traumatic stress might look like, Now we're going to take some time to focus on compassion fatigue. So we'll start with a brief little silly video.
Compassion fatigue cycle. Zealot idealist. We are committed, involved, and available, ready to problem solve, ready to make a difference. We willingly put in extra hours. Our enthusiasm overflows. We volunteer. We are willing to go the extra mile and often do so without prompting. Irritability. We realize that we work in imperfect systems. We begin to distance ourselves from students, coworkers, and friends. We cut corners. We begin to avoid student and parent contact. We begin to belittle our colleagues and students and parents. We talk unfairly about their challenges. We denigrate their efforts. Oversights and mistakes begin to occur. We begin to distance ourselves from friends and coworkers. Withdrawal. Our enthusiasm turns sour. We lose our ability to see our students as individuals. Rather, they become irritants. Complaints may be made about our work, and we may have problems in our personal lives. We are tired all the time. We neglect our family, our coworkers, our students, and ourselves. Our shields get thicker and thicker, and it blocks our pain and sadness. Chronic exhaustion, physical illness, difficulty empathizing, and feeling numb to others' pain. Zombie. Our hopelessness turns to rage. We begin to hate people, any and all people. We even hate our coworkers. Others become incompetent or ignorant in our eyes. We develop a disdain for students and parents. We have no patience and a sense that we can never do enough. Sleeplessness, sense of persecution. Renewal versus pathology. Pathology and victimization versus maturation and renewal. Overwhelmed and leaving the profession, somatic illness, perpetuity of symptoms, or hardiness, resiliency, and transformation. Meow.
Okay, so that's just a cute little video to illustrate this compassion fatigue cycle that we're going to go through. So it really breaks down each of the different phases that I'm actually going to spell out for you right now. So it's a nice way to introduce the concept. So when you think about entering the field, you think about when you first started doing the work. And for some of you, you may have to think back a little bit longer. This may take a little bit of more effort, and that's okay. So think back to that time and think about why you entered this field. Think about what your hopes were. You probably felt a lot of excitement about being able to help a kid at a time, or being able to save the world, or whatever it might be. Just think about that enthusiasm that you felt. That is what we call that zealot or idealist phase. So we are committed, we're involved, and we're available to save the world. Unfortunately, oftentimes this doesn't last very long for most of us in the field. So the next step becomes irritability. So we see the very imperfect nature of the systems and people around us. We begin to distance ourselves from clients, from their families, coworkers, and friends. We notice our anger, our cynicism, diminished creativity, and sadness. Those very policies that are oftentimes meant to be protective sometimes cause harm. So for example, let's think of if we have a family who is suddenly homeless, and we have a mother who has a small child, but also has a teenage son. And in this particular shelter, teenage males are not allowed. So the family has to be split up. So we can see the purpose between such policies, but we also see the harm. So here we see how imperfect the system is, and we find ourselves becoming angry or irritable. Then we have withdrawal. So here, the shield that we put up, or that callus that we put up to block out the pain and sadness of our work, becomes thicker. And thus it becomes more difficult to empathize with others. And clients now become our irritants. So that callus, to a certain degree, is necessary in order to be able to withstand and do the work. But it can't be too thick, because then, as I mentioned some slides back, what happens is we're blocking out all emotions in an attempt to only block out the unpleasant ones. So this creates that challenge in being able to connect with others, to be able to connect with your clients, your students, to be able to connect with your coworkers, your staff, whatever that might look like. So when this happens, when this callus becomes too thick, we find ourselves going into this zombie phase. So here, our hopelessness turns to rage. We view those around us as incompetent or ignorant, and we begin to silo ourselves. So in this phase, we're oftentimes just going through the motions once we get here. Fine, I'll just do it myself. I'm not even gonna ask for help. I'm just here to do my work and go home. You find yourself really no longer interacting with your team or making those efforts to branch out, to get help, to connect, to consult with each other about different things related to a case or a particular student that you might be working with. So this phase can lead to two different routes. Remember how we had that process chart a few slides back where I said it could be positive or it could be a negative outcome. So here, what that looks like for the compassion fatigue cycle is either pathology or renewal. So for pathology, what we have here is, you might come to this fork in the road where you continue deeper into compassion fatigue, where you now are feeling like a victim. You're feeling overwhelmed, you're leaving the profession, there's high turnover happening, there's a changing of positions and then repeating of the cycle all over again. There's somatic illness, finding yourself sick all the time. Or on the positive end, there's a possibility for maturation and renewal. So that's the development of that hardiness, of resiliency, of transformation, of a space where you're able to take these difficulties, this imperfect nature of the system, and come up with ideas to make changes that would help out the population that you work with, help out the staff, help out the workplace that you're in. Unfortunately, more times than not, what we see here is pathology, right? Rather than renewal, but it is possible. It is possible. So what are some signs of compassion fatigue? I gave you my own personal example of what it looked like for me with, secretly hoping that some clients wouldn't show up for sessions, or just feeling that dread, being checked out. So here are some additional ones as well. Feeling burdened by the suffering of others, finding yourself blaming others for their own suffering, loss of pleasure in your life, difficulty concentrating, difficulty being present, insomnia, feeling tired physically as well as mentally, beginning to receive a lot of complaints about your work or attitude, and if that's a big red flag, if any. Bottling up your emotions, just really checking out, increased nightmares, feelings of hopelessness or powerless over your situation, over the ability to make some change or create some change in the lives of your clients or your students. You might experience that you are having frequent complaining about your work or your life. You might be having some overeating that's taking place, excessive use of drugs or alcohol, poor self-care, as well as denial. So here we have signs of compassion fatigue in an organizational setting, in the organization, because organizations are made up of individuals, right? So over time, what we see is the collective impact of a bunch of individuals, a bunch of staff that are all experiencing compassion fatigue. So here we have a lot of different ways that this might show up in your organization. You might see higher rates of absenteeism, people calling off, Lots of folks taking mental health days at a higher frequency. You might see that teams are having a really hard time working well together, that you might have a multidisciplinary program, but the multidisciplines are not working together. So you might also see this aggressive behaviors or lack of willingness to follow along with rules and policies and procedures. Difficulty for staff to meet deadlines, to be able to get paperwork in on time, lack of flexibility, negativity overall towards management, a lack of vision for the future because ultimately staff are checked out. They don't feel like anything can change. There's that hopelessness that's beginning to set in, right? And it's really important that if you're in a leadership position, that you help your staff to have this sense of connection to the reason why we are doing the work that we're doing. Because once we completely lose that, it's really hard to regain it at times. So I'm going to share with you all a resource. One second. What we have here is the ProQual, or Professional Quality of Life Scale. This is an excellent tool that I oftentimes recommend in our organizational values and trauma-informed care training, which is more so about how to anticipate trauma in the organizational setting and different tools and techniques and resources you can put in place to support staff. So, but it's also very, very much so relevant in this training as well. This is a scale and assessment that you can take yourself to see where you rate, or that you can give to your colleagues or give to your supervisees to do check-ins on a regular basis. Some folks find themselves doing this once every 6 months or once a year or at annual reviews with supervisors. It's a really great conversation starter. So what this does is there's 30 questions that are based on a Likert scale, which asks you about your experience and the work that you're doing over the last 30 days. These questions are pretty straightforward. And what happens is based on your responses, you get scores on your level of compassion satisfaction, which is that pleasure that you have about doing your work well and being satisfied with the work that you are doing overall. It also measures your level of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. Taking these scores and bringing them in as a place to start conversation is a great way to check in with yourself and develop different goals and techniques and self-care practices and coping strategies to be able to combat the effects of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. So this resource will be shared with you all. Actually, it just was awesome. So this is a really cool tool to use, but you have to make sure that you are using it on a frequent basis, because the idea is, you know, the more that we do it, the more that we're checking in with ourselves and taking active steps to be able to combat the wear and tear of empathic connection with our students, with our clients, with the populations that we work with, then the less you will be experiencing all of these different types of caring traumas. So now let's get into vicarious trauma a bit. What is vicarious trauma? So as I alluded to some slides back, it's that cumulative effect of working with survivors of traumatic life events. And anyone who engages empathically with victims or survivors is vulnerable. You don't have to just be doing this work professionally. If you're engaging with these populations at all, you are vulnerable to it. You could just be volunteering. You're vulnerable to it. So it includes that identity piece, that sense of safety, that it impacts your ability to trust others and to trust yourself. It also impacts our self-esteem as well as our intimacy and our sense of control over the things that take place in our lives. So we're going to watch a video here next, which does a really good job of illustrating just that. And after that, we will continue to talk a little bit more about what vicarious trauma looks like and how we can keep an eye out for it.
I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is, and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, "Hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off." And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. Survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not going to have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted. I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others' suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, "Are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you?" And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview.
Okay, so I think that video does an amazing job too of really, really showing you from a firsthand experience the way that vicarious trauma shows up when it really has hit its boiling point, right? Some of the things that she said echoes some of the things that I've already said, and that it is slow moving, and sometimes it can be very hard to track and monitor if we are not tuned in and making a conscious effort to check in with ourselves on a periodic basis. Another thing that she mentioned that I think is important to also touch on is how she said that she grew up in a family where there was this message that if you care enough about what you're doing, if you're down with the cause enough, then you're going to suck it up. But we have to remember that we are not martyrs, right? We do very difficult work and we sit with very difficult things. But that does not mean that we just allow ourselves to be so empathic to the point that we are martyrs, that we're not taking care of ourselves. it is possible to take care of ourselves in this while we're doing the work that we are doing, in order to be able to have sustainability and be able to continue to do our best work on a long-term basis in this field. So these are just some of the examples of vicarious trauma. Some of them she mentioned, some of them I mentioned a little bit earlier on in today's training. So here are some additional examples of what vicarious trauma might look like from person to person. So first we have here, a rape crisis hotline volunteer begins to assume that all men are unsafe based on the things that this particular person is hearing day after day or night after night from the phone calls that they are receiving at the rape crisis hotline. So she or he begins to generalize, right? And then we have a second example here that a nurse finds himself thinking, yeah, right, whatever, in response to a story told by a friend or a colleague with whom he has always had a trusting relationship. So becoming very cynical, very negative. And then we have a social worker whose favorite way to relax is to spend time with her children, finds herself wishing they would just go away. So that's isolation, right? That's that withdrawal. That's that loss of interest in activities that you once enjoyed. And then we have here a counselor has nightmares about the traumatic experience of their clients. So that's that vicarious trauma, but it also could be secondary traumatic stress as well. So we also have here what we call the silence and response, which oftentimes happens when we are experiencing vicarious trauma. So the silence and response refers to the helper's inability to attend to the stories and experiences of their clients by redirecting to material that's less distressing or uncomfortable. So some of the ways this might show up is your student, your program participant might be sharing something difficult with you or something challenging with you, and you might be trying to change the subject or providing pat answers or, oh, well, we're just gonna focus on the positive. We're not gonna worry about that. You might find yourself being angry or sarcastic, using humor to change or minimize the subject, blaming the clients or the students themselves for their own experience. You might find yourself pretending to listen, but you're not really. You're really thinking about what you're gonna have for dinner tonight. Not being able to pay attention, being afraid of what's gonna be said, or just suggesting the person get over it. So here we have a prevalence of vicarious trauma. As you can imagine, it's very, very high rates of vicarious trauma being reported by those of us. So at the individual level, you'll notice some of the things here are going to overlap with some of the things that you all shared. So we have boundaries. What does your boundaries look like? Do you have boundaries? Are you able to say no when you just do not have the capacity? What about your own personal trauma? Has it been addressed or has it not been addressed? Do you yourself have found a therapist that you can work with? Are you able to talk about some of the triggers that come up for you if you have a reflective supervision space? Also, measuring your self-worth by how much you help others is a very, very dangerous place to be in. Also, self-care. Are you actively engaging in regular self-care? And also thinking about your current life circumstances. Right now with this pandemic, it has made things very, very hard for many of us, and much harder for those of us who have already been in these marginalized spaces, right? Then we have the organizational component. Is peer supervision support available? Is there regular trauma-informed supervision? Is training available? Who's being sent to training and how often is training taking place? What about workloads? We know, especially in the social work field, especially in the education field, workloads tend to be very much so off balance. Access to and the ability to take time off, and then the ability for staff to bring their whole selves into work rather than have to put on a mask. Then at the societal level, as Brianne mentioned, there's so much. I could go on and on and on, but for the sake of time, we'll just read these five. We've got the mismatch of the perception of and value assigned to care work and the funding of nonprofits. So when we think about that, we think about the example I gave when you introduce yourself to someone, you talk about the work you do, and it's, oh my gosh, what you're doing is so important. We need more teachers, we need more therapists, we need more social workers, we need all these things, but where is the resources that can be pulled into this population of care workers, right? Where is the resources and the assistance to be able to help us to be able to sustain and take care of ourselves? And also screen time, political climate, media violence. All these societal level things also contribute to the higher likelihood of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. So now we're going to just touch very, very quickly on self-care and collective care. We have a couple of resources that are going to be shared out with you in the chat box as it relates to self-care as well. So self-care refers to any intentional actions that you take to take care of your physical, mental, and emotional health, and to alleviate or prevent the symptoms of vicarious trauma. So something I want to note here is self-care is intentional, as I mentioned earlier today. It's not always a fun thing to do, but it is necessary. Self-care is not just manicures and pedicures and a night out with your friends. It also looks like boundaries. Self-care also requires discipline, and it addresses each of the different dimensions of yourself and your personal experience. It's something that's both preventative and addresses the wear and tear of the job that you're doing. So this shows us the domains of self-care. So essentially what this is saying is that in our experience, in our life, we have many different parts of our lives, many different dimensions of our lives, right? We work, but we also have family. We also have interpersonal lives. We also are taking care of our physical health or not taking care of our physical health. We are creatures that have all these different elements to our existence. So with that, it's important that your self-care focuses on each of these different elements as well. So for example, physical might look like, are you exercising regularly? Are you eating healthy food? On the mental end, are you making time for self-reflection? Do you have your own personal counseling or therapy? Emotional might look like allowing yourself to cry, finding things that make you feel good, finding things that make you laugh. On an interpersonal level, identifying a group of people that you can call on for support. Setting appropriate limits within your relationships that make you feel safe. On a spiritual level, cherishing your optimism and hope, pouring into that, doing things that pour into that. And on a professional or school level, taking a break throughout the workday or school day to eat lunch and have time to just chat with your coworkers about stuff that's not about the work that you're doing. Balancing your caseload or your workload so that no one part of the day feels like too much. And very quickly, what past self alludes to is having compassion for who you've been up to this point, even for those decisions that maybe you regret or don't feel so great about, because ultimately, whatever those decisions and choices were, they got you to where you are right now. That compassion and for your future self just means thinking about who it is that you ultimately would like to be, and looking at yourself right now and the things that you're doing, your activities, your domains of self-care, and asking yourself, are these things helping me to become that person, or are they taking me away from who that person is? So here we talk more about boundaries and self-care, and we have a resource that we're going to share with you about boundaries as well. I believe there's 2 resources. And this just tells you some different things that we can do to practice healthy boundaries. But as it says in here in bold, people will not always like you having boundaries. Be prepared for that, and that is okay. They will be all right. Because we have to do what we can to take care of ourselves so we can be the best versions of ourselves possible. So here we have collective care. Taking it back to one of my original messages, we do not exist in this world in a vacuum. That being said, it's really important that we recognize the importance of collective care just as much as we place emphasis on self-care. So self-care is more of that Western concept, but we must invest in people in order to be able to make sure that the collective is doing well. So some of the ways that you can do this is being aware of any sensitive issues or subjects that may need a trigger warning. So that's like myself and Courtney at the beginning of this training saying, hey, we're going to be talking about trauma. It may be triggering. Make sure that you do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. Also respecting your colleagues when they tell you they need to be offline. Learning to say no, as I mentioned earlier. And we have several other examples of different ways that you can practice collective care here. So what I encourage you to do is, and this is just another example of how to practice low impact disclosure, sharing details of traumatic events or stories, making sure that you're doing it in a way that is not traumatizing the listener. So what I encourage you all to do here is we have the systems of self-care. So I encourage you to really take a look at the handout that you are being provided by Courtney of today's training, to have conversations about what self-care looks like at these different levels within your organization. These questions are talking points to help to spark conversation and ideas, to put things into place to help to prevent vicarious trauma, and for those of us that are experiencing it, put things into place to help to combat the effects of it and lessen and reduce it, and replace it with healthy ways of managing stress and coping and dealing with the different things that are coming into our work. So here, this is a statement of compassion for yourself and for others. Think of someone who you've struggled with recently, and while thinking about this person, tell yourself, just like me, this person is seeking happiness in their life. Just like me, this person is trying to avoid suffering in their life. Just like me, this person has known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Just like me, this person is seeking to fill their needs. And just like me, this person is learning about life. So with that, we have reached the end of today's training. I'm so grateful to you all for being here today.